I've always been the kind of person who finds comfort in being alone. While my friends eagerly planned trips to crowded beach resorts or busy cities filled with nightlife, I preferred silence. Give me a map, a backpack, and miles of forest, and I'm at peace. Solitude has never frightened me. In fact, it has always felt honest because there will be no distractions, no expectations, just the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. That's why I chose to spend 48 hours at Blackwood Ridge. It's the kind of place hikers talk about in lowered voices. It was remote and touched. Once you pass a certain point on the trail, your phone loses all signal and becomes nothing more than an overpriced flashlight and camera. No reception, no quick way out, just wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. The first day was exactly what I needed. I hiked nearly 6 miles into the interior, far enough that I didn't pass another person after the first hour. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. By late afternoon, I found a clearing beside a narrow, crystal-clear stream. The water moved gently over smooth stones, and tall pine trees formed a natural barrier around the space. It felt private, safe. I set up my one-man tent near the edge of the trees, careful to avoid low branches and loose rocks. I filtered water from the stream, cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, and watched the sun melt into the horizon. When darkness finally settled in, it came fast and complete. Out there, night isn't dim, it's absolute. The stars, however, were breathtaking. With no light pollution, the sky looked almost unreal, thick with constellations. I lay back against a rock and let the quiet soak into me. The wind moved gently through the pines, creating a soft, steady rustling. It was peaceful. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have the entire forest to myself. That thought feels different now. The second night is the one I can't forget. It was exactly midnight when something pulled me from a deep sleep. At first, I didn't understand what had woken me. Then I heard it again. A heavy, wet crunch of leaves. Not the scattered crackle of a squirrel or deer. This was slow, deliberate, and far too close. My eyes snapped open in the darkness of the tent. For a moment, I couldn't move. My heart began to pound so hard it felt like it might echo through the thin nylon walls. I held my breath and listened. Whatever it was had entered the clearing. I told myself it was an animal, because Blackwood Ridge is home to deer, wild boar, even the occasional black bear. But there was something wrong about the rhythm of the movement. It didn't shuffle or sniff. It paused between steps, as if calculating. Then I felt it. The side of my tent pressed inward, like a slow, steady pressure, as if someone were leaning their full body weight against it. The nylon stretched tight. I stared, frozen, as the wall bowed toward me. And then I saw it clearly. I saw a flat hand shape pressing against the fabric. It began to slide downward, dragging across the tent with a rough, scratching sound that vibrated through the poles. The movement intentional. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking despite my effort to sound firm. The pressure vanished instantly. Silence crashed over the clearing. With shaking hands, I grabbed my hunting knife and reached for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent in one swift motion and swung the beam in a wide arc around me. I see nothing. The trees stood motionless. The stream trickled calmly as if nothing had disturbed it. No retreating footsteps. No snapping branches. No glowing animal eyes reflecting in the light. I stepped out barefoot, scanning the perimeter of my camp. I circled every tree within 20 yards. The ground was layered in leaves, but I couldn't see clear prints, at least not in the uneven light. Everything looked undisturbed. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal leaning curiously against the tent. Maybe my imagination had filled in the details. I crawled back inside, though my body no longer felt relaxed. I kept the knife in my hand this time. 10 minutes passed. Then I heard the same sound again. This time it wasn't just one side. The sound moved slowly around the tent, dragging across the nylon roof like long nails tracing a surface. I could follow its path by the subtle shifting of the fabric. It was circling me. My breathing grew shallow. I didn't dare speak again. The scratching stopped directly above me. And then the weight returned. The top of the tent pushed downward, forcing the ceiling toward my face. The poles bent slightly under the pressure. It wasn't testing the structure. It was leaning in, pressing down as if trying to feel what was inside. I didn't unzip the tent again. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I sat in the very center of the floor, knees pulled to my chest. Knife clutched so tightly my hand cramped. Every nerve in my body felt electric. The scratching continued on and off for what felt like hours. Sometimes it would stop completely, plunging the world into suffocating silence. Then it would resume, as if reminding me it was still there. When the first faint gray light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, the sound stopped entirely. I didn't hesitate. The moment there was enough light to see clearly, I burst out of the tent. The clearing looked ordinary again. Calm. Peaceful. I didn't inspect the ground this time. I didn't pack my gear. My tent, sleeping bag, stove, everything stayed where it was. I grabbed only my keys and ran toward the trailhead, branches snapping under my boots as I moved faster than I ever had in those woods. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Even now, weeks later, I replay it in my mind. The shape of that hand, the slow, deliberate pressure, the breathing. I've camped alone for years because of that experience. I know the sounds of wildlife. I know how fear can twist perception, but I also know what I felt pressing down on that tent. And I know it wasn't human. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think the fabric would have been the only thing bending under pressure. It might be my life. There were 8 of us in total. 4 tents, 2 fire pits, enough food and cheap beer to last 3 nights. We had just graduated from college, and this trip was supposed to be our final celebration before adulthood scattered us across different cities and careers. We chose a remote spot in the high Sierras, far beyond the popular camping grounds. It took hours of hiking to reach the clearing we picked, but that was the point. We wanted isolation. We wanted it to feel like the world belonged to us for one last weekend. The first night felt perfect. We set up camp in a wide clearing surrounded by tall pines and granite outcrops. The air was thin and crisp, and the sky at that altitude looked impossibly close. We built 2 fire pits and kept them burning side by side. Someone brought a speaker, though it barely competed with our own laughter. We roasted marshmallows, passed around stories from freshman year, and made promises to stay in touch no matter what happened next. At some point, Leo stood up dramatically and declared this the last night of our irresponsible lives. We all cheered. It felt true in a strange way. We were suspended between youth and adulthood, and nothing in that moment felt dangerous. If anything, the mountains felt like they were embracing us. When I crawled into my tent that first night, the sound of my friends still laughing around the fire drifted through the fabric. I fell asleep smiling, convinced that this memory would be one of the good ones I'd replay years later. The second morning began normally, at least at first. I woke to sunlight pressing against the tent walls and the faint smell of burned wood from the previous night's fire. For a few seconds, I just lay there, enjoying the quiet. Then something felt off. There was no sound coming from outside. No one is talking. No zippers unfastening. No clatter of someone digging through a cooler. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. That is when I found out that 2 of the tents were gone. The patch of ground where they had been was bare, as though nothing had ever stood there. Mike's tent and Sarah's tent along with the twins' gear had completely vanished. At first, I thought they were messing with us. Maybe they had woken up early and decided to hike around, but that didn't explain the missing coolers or chairs. Their entire setups had disappeared. I walked over to Leo's tent and called out. He stumbled out half awake, squinting into the sunlight. "Where are Mike and Sarah?" I asked. Leo looked around slowly, confusion settling in. "What do you mean?" We checked the entire clearing. No sign of them. No scattered belongings. No footprints leading away, at least none we could clearly see on the hardened dirt. After a few minutes of uneasy silence, Leo shrugged. "They probably hiked back to the truck early," he said. "You know Sarah. One mosquito and she's done." A couple of the others laughed, though it sounded forced. We convinced ourselves it made sense. Maybe they had argued. Maybe they got spooked by some animal during the night. None of us wanted to admit that the situation was strange. That time, we were young, confident and arrogant. The idea that something had happened to them felt dramatic, unreal. So we stayed. The second day passed with an undercurrent of tension none of us acknowledged out loud. We hiked. We swam in a nearby stream. We tried to recreate the energy of the first night, but the laughter came slower. The jokes didn't land as hard. Every time someone disappeared briefly to use the woods, I noticed how the rest of us would subtly count the minutes until they returned. By the third night, the atmosphere had changed completely. The clearing felt smaller somehow. The darkness seemed thicker. We sat around the fire, but no one stayed up late this time. One by one, people retreated into their tents. By midnight, the clearing was silent except for the faint crackling of dying embers. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up with the urgent need to relieve myself. I groaned quietly, unzipped my sleeping bag, and reached for the tent flap. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me immediately. For a second, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I expected to see the faint orange glow of the fire pit and the shapes of Leo's and the others' tents scattered around the clearing. Instead, I saw nothing. My tent stood alone in the center. Leo's tent was gone. The remaining gear was gone. The coolers, the folding chairs, The backpacks we had stacked near the trees is gone also. The clearing was empty, completely empty. No torn fabric, no overturned dirt, no signs of a struggle. The ground looked untouched, as though the earth had swallowed 6 people, and every trace of their existence without disturbing so much as a pebble. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't call their names. I didn't even whisper. A deep, instinctive fear settled in my chest. It told me that if I made a sound, if I announced myself in any way, whatever had taken them would notice me also, and it would finish the job. I stood frozen for several seconds, listening. The silence was overwhelming, almost physical. No wind, no insects, no distant animal calls. Just a stillness so complete it made my ears ring. Slowly, carefully, I stepped back into my tent. I didn't zip it closed fully. I left the flap slightly open so I could see out. I sat with my back pressed against the center pole, staring at the zipper line. Every snap of a twig in the distance felt like a gunshot. Every shift of fabric made my pulse spike. I didn't sleep. I waited. When the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I moved. I didn't pack carefully. I shoved what I could into my backpack with shaking hands and abandoned the rest. I didn't look toward the empty spaces where my friends' tents had once stood. Instead, I ran. The 4 miles back to the trailhead felt endless. My lungs burned, and my legs threatened to give out. But I didn't slow down. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me or to see someone stepping out from between the trees. When I reached the parking lot, I almost collapsed from relief. My truck was the only vehicle there. No sign that anyone else had ever parked beside me. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. At first, they looked skeptical. 8 college graduates camping, drinking, possibly wandering off. It sounded like the beginning of a bad decision story. But when they checked the permits and realized 7 people were unaccounted for, the tone shifted. They organized a search and rescue operation within hours. Helicopters, tracking dogs, volunteers combing through miles of forest. But they found nothing. No scraps of tent fabric, no footprints leading off cliffs, no blood, no abandoned supplies. It was as if my friends had simply ceased to exist. They're still listed as missing. Sometimes, late at night, I replayed those 3 days in my head. I questioned every detail. Did I miss something? Did I ignore signs that something was wrong? And sometimes, a darker thought creeps in. What if they're still out there? Not lost, not dead. Just somewhere I can no longer find. A clearing hidden deeper in the mountains. A campsite where the fire still burns. And maybe they're waiting for me to come back and finally join them. Jake and I had been talking for months about getting out of the city for 5 days, without traffic, deadlines, or the constant buzz of notifications. After some research and a few recommendations from hiking forums, we chose a quiet clearing near the base of the Iron Mountains. It wasn't a popular tourist spot, which was exactly why we picked it, because we wanted distance from people, from noise, from everything. The first 2 days were exactly what we needed. We hiked during the afternoons, cooked simple meals over the fire, and spent long evenings talking about nothing important. The clearing was wide and open, bordered by thick forest on all sides. During the day, sunlight poured in through the treetops. At night, the sky turned black and endless, scattered with stars. It felt untouched and safe. Everything changed on the second night. We were sitting by the fire when we heard footsteps approaching from the tree line. Not the cautious shuffle of an animal, but steady, deliberate steps. Jake and I exchanged a look before turning toward the sound. An old man stepped into the clearing. He looked to be in his late 70s, maybe older. His beard was long and silver, reaching almost to his chest. His face was deeply lined, like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. But it was his eyes that unsettled me. They were sharp and focused. He introduced himself as Silas and asked politely if he could set up camp nearby. We didn't see any reason to refuse. The mountains were open to anyone, and he didn't seem threatening at first glance. He pitched his small tent about 20 yards from ours, just at the edge of the clearing. Being social by nature, Jake invited him over for dinner. Silas accepted with an easy smile. Around the fire, he was surprisingly charming. He told stories about traveling the country in his youth, about hunting trips and old jobs he claimed to have worked decades ago. He spoke clearly, confidently. If anything, he seemed like a lonely old man grateful for company. At one point, he leaned forward to stir the fire. That's when Jake noticed it. Tucked into the waistband of Silas's trousers was the heavy black grip of a handgun. Jake tried to sound casual. "Is that for the bears?" Silas paused, then patted the weapon slowly. A thin smile stretched across his face, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's for protection, son," he said calmly. "When you get to my age, you'll learn that the most dangerous things in these woods don't have fur." The comment hung in the air longer than it should have. Still, we brushed it off. Plenty of hikers carry firearms in remote areas. It wasn't illegal, and Silas hadn't done anything openly threatening. The third day passed without incident, though I couldn't shake a subtle feeling of discomfort. Silas lingered near our campsite more than necessary. Even when he returned to his tent, I had the strange impression that he was watching us. On the fourth afternoon, Silas mentioned that some of his old friends were planning to join him. "And they'll be here by nightfall," he said, almost casually. We didn't think much of it. A few more campers in the area didn't seem like a problem. In fact, we assumed it might turn into a bigger gathering around the fire. That evening, we cooked a large pot of tea and shared the last of our coffee. Silas seemed quieter than usual, but not in an obvious way, just observant. Since he was alone and his tent was small, we offered to let him sleep inside our larger four-man tent for the night. It felt like the polite thing to do. The temperature was dropping, and we figured it would be more comfortable for him. He agreed immediately. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the wind brushing lightly against the tent fabric. Then, sometime around 4 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. Then I heard whispering. It's low, muffled. Multiple voices speaking at once. The language wasn't English. At least, I don't think it was. It sounded fragmented, almost rhythmic, like murmurs layered on top of each other. I held my breath and turned my head. The spot where Silas had been sleeping was empty. His sleeping bag lay flat and undisturbed, but he was gone. I nudged Jake awake. He listened for a second before his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. The whispering was still there, just outside the tent walls. We didn't say anything. We slowly reached for the zipper and stepped outside together. The clearing had changed. Silas's tent was gone. His small fire pit, the folding stool he carried, even the faint indentation where his gear had rested. All of it had disappeared. And then I noticed the tree line. Shapes inhuman stood between the trunks, tall, thin, perfectly still. At first, I thought they were shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But they shifted slightly in subtle movements that proved they were real. There weren't just a few of them. There were dozens. They stood evenly spaced, surrounding the clearing in a wide circle. None of them stepped forward. None of them spoke. They simply watched. I couldn't mark out their faces. Only silhouettes with long limbs, narrow shoulders, heads tilted slightly in our direction. Jake whispered, "Don't run." But my body had already decided. The whispering grew louder, though still indistinguishable. Not aggressive, not rushed. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We grabbed our car keys and ran. We left our tent standing. Left our backpacks, food, everything. Branches snapped under our boots as we sprinted through the trees toward the narrow dirt road where we'd parked. I didn't look back. I was too afraid of what I might see if I did. We reached the car breathless and shaking. Jake fumbled the keys twice before finally unlocking it. We peeled out of there without headlights for the first few seconds. Too panicked to think clearly. We drove straight to the nearest police station and reported a suspicious group in the mountains. We described Silas, the gun, the figures in the trees. The officers listened carefully, though I could see doubt in their expressions. The next day, they conducted a sweep of the area. They found our tent. It had been slashed to ribbons from the inside out. Our sleeping bags were torn open, our supplies scattered, but there was no sign of Silas. No sign of another campsite. No footprints other than ours. And no record of anyone by the name Silas living in nearby towns or registering for park access. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, I know what I saw. I still think about that smile he gave when he mentioned protection. I think about how easily he accepted sleeping inside our tent. How calm he seemed when he spoke about his old friends. He didn't bring them to our camp. He brought us to theirs. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I wake up convinced I can hear faint whispering outside my window, layered voices, speaking in a language I still don't understand.